Good evening. I'm going to talk today about the Cold War begins. Many Americans feared that the end of World War II would bring a return of the Great Depression. In early 1945, before the end of the war in Europe, the United States was extremely eager to secure the Soviet Union's participation in the projected invasion of Japan, because American casualties were expected to be high if only Americans were involved, and Soviet help could reduce the number of American casualties. This will lead to the important wartime conference, the last one between FDR, Stalin, and Churchill at Yalta on the Crimean on the northern coast of the Black Sea. And the key decisions made by the big three, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill at the Yalta Convention, were that the Soviet Union would attack Japan within 3 months of the end of the European War in exchange for territorial concessions. The Soviet Union would sponsor free elections in Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. Occupation zones in Germany would be assigned to each of the victorious powers. A new international peacekeeping organization, the United States, would be set up. In 1945, the greatest asset of the Soviet Union in world politics was its vast army, victorious over the Germans and occupying Eastern Europe. But by 1945, the Soviet Union had reason to be suspicious of the United States because the British and Americans had delayed opening a second front in Western Europe, specifically in France, until 1944. The British and Americans had not informed the Soviet Union of the Manhattan Project and the development of the first atomic bomb until it was completed, as well as the ideological differences of capitalism and communism that reemerged when the common threat or the common enemy of Nazi Germany was defeated, and the U.S. abruptly ended Lend-Lease aid at the end of World War II. Despite their political and strategic differences, the United States and the Soviet Union strongly resembled one another in 1945, and that they had largely been isolated from world affairs and practiced an ideological missionary foreign policy. In 1944 as well, before the end of the war, the Bretton Woods system would be established. Most direct effect of the Bretton Woods system on the post-war international economy was that it encouraged stable prices, liberalized trade, flexible domestic markets, and fixed exchange rates. And it will also establish, with much U.S. money, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But probably the greatest legacy of the World War II was the establishment of the United Nations. Unlike the failed League of Nations, the new United Nations was established in a spirit of cooperation before the war's actual end. And in fact, it will meet in San Francisco 1 month after FDR's death in the spring of 1945. One of the most significant structural differences between the old League of Nations and the United Nations was that the UN gave a veto in the powerful Security Council to the 5 great powers. The 5 great powers would be Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, the United States, and China. In the early years, the United Nations was successful in preventing warfare over Kashmir and Iran, creating the new state of Israel, guiding former European colonies to independence, and enhancing global health, food production, and cultural development. But the earliest and most serious failure of the United Nations involved its inability to control atomic energy, especially the manufacture of weapons. But the crucial origins of the Cold War lay in a fundamental disagreement between the United States and the Soviet Union over post-war arrangements in Eastern Europe, the area in which Stalin's post-war security concerns focused, and the territory or area where the Soviet Union occupied. It occupied the entire Eastern European area because it will basically come across from the Soviet Union, across Eastern Europe, and enter Germany. And in May 1945, it will basically seize and capture Berlin. So a crucial early development of the Cold War occurred when Germany was divided into an East Germany under Soviet control and a pro-American West Germany. Alarmed by the revitalization of the Berlin economy under the Marshall Plan, the Soviet Union will impose a blockade on all highway, rail, and river traffic to West Berlin. This will result of two things. The policy towards the Soviet Union that George F. Kennan proposed in 1946 involved using diplomatic and economic pressure to confront the Soviet Union with a counterforce wherever it encroached on the interests of world peace and stability. The fundamental idea of President Truman and George Kennan's containment doctrine was Soviet expansion should be blocked by firm but not aggressive military and diplomatic strength. The immediate crisis that prompted the announcement of the Truman Doctrine was related to the threat of a communist takeover in Greece and Turkey, which were basically consumed by civil wars fought between two forces, pro-West, pro-democratic, and pro-communist. Under the Truman Doctrine, the United States pledged to support those who were resisting subjugation by communists with military aid and assistance. Because of the threat of internal takeovers by Western European communist parties, especially in France and Italy, this will encourage the United States to initiate the Marshall Plan of economic assistance. Truman's Marshall Plan called for substantial finance assistance to rebuild Western Europe's infrastructure. It will pass Congress largely because it was perceived there as anti-communists. And the communist coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia will break a political stalemate between the Republican-controlled Congress and the Democratic President Truman, clearing the way for the appropriation of funds for the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan succeeded in reviving Europe's economy and thwarting or preventing the large internal communist parties' takeover, threatening to take over in Italy and France. The Marshall Plan required all participating nations to exchange economic information and work towards the elimination of tariffs and other trade barriers. Like I said before, Stalin will refuse to participate in the Marshall Plan, even though he was offered financial assistance by the United States, and alarmed by the revitalization of Berlin economy under the Marshall Plan, the West Berlin economy under the Marshall Plan, the Soviet Union imposed a blockade on all highway, rail, and river traffic to West Berlin. So in 1948, when the Soviet Union denied the United States, Britain, and France access to Berlin, that is West Berlin, President Truman will respond by organizing a giant airlift of supplies to Berlin that will basically continue for over a year. Everything that was needed by the West Berliners will basically be transported into West Berlin by air. And by the year's end, the Berlin blockade will end because Stalin realized he was not going to force the United States, Britain, and France out of West Berlin. When the United States joined with Canada and Western Europe to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, NATO was the first peacetime military alliance that the nation had entered since the American Revolution. The NATO alliance was established to protect Western Europe from military attack by Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So the NATO alliance represented a historic transformation in American foreign policy because it committed the United States to a permanent peacetime alliance with other nations. Why we joined the first peacetime military alliance in our nation's history since the American Revolution is that it was precipitated by the communist coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia and the Berlin blockade, both events that happened in 1948. So American membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization strengthened the containment of the Soviet Union, helped reintegrate Germany, West Germany that is, in the European family, reassured Europeans that the United States would not abandon them, and struck a major blow to American isolationism. So the United States' participation in NATO reaffirmed America's long-standing commitment to the defense of Western Europe. The new Japanese government installed by General Douglas MacArthur in 1946 pledged itself to provide women's equality, introduce a Western-style democratic constitution, paved the way for a spectacular economic recovery, and renounced militarism. The U.S. policy towards Asia in the years 1949-1950 at first centered on a revitalized China, but political instability there prompted the Truman administration to focus on developing the Japanese economy instead. The issue in China was a civil war between the communists led by Mao Zedong and the Chinese nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. But the Chiang Kai-shek and the national government will lose support and confidence of the Chinese people because of corruption, and that is the reason why they will lose the Chinese Civil War to the communists and Mao Zedong in 1949 and flee to the island of Taiwan. And in 1945, the People's Republic of China will be established as the second communist government in the world. When the Chinese communists defeated the nationalists in 1949, the U.S. found itself plunged into political recrimination about who was to blame for the fall of China. Republicans used the communist victory in the Chinese War to claim that pro-communist elements of the Truman administration had prevented Chiang Kai-shek from winning. In the summer of 1950, North Korean forces will invade the South. At the end of World War II, the Korean Peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel into two countries. North Korea would be communist, while South Korea would be pro-West and democratic. Truman's response to the invasion of South Korea was to ask the UN Security Council to authorize a police action. And his action upon hearing the invasion of South Korea illustrated his commitment to a foreign policy of containment. Just before the beginning of the Korean War, the National Security Council's 1950 document, NSC 68, held that the United States must significantly increase its defense spending. Also, the National Security Act of 1947 will create the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and the Department of the Defense. The content of the National Security Council's 1950 document NSC 68 can be described as a response to the news of the Soviet Union's first nuclear test in 1949. So we will only hold a monopoly on atomic weaponry from 1945 to 1949. NSC 68 called for a massive increase in military spending, and this document, the NSC 68 document, reflected the American belief in the limitless capabilities of the U.S. economy and society. In the Korean War, the North Koreans invaded South Korea, driving the South Korean and U.S. forces into the area around Pusan, right here. MacArthur will land at Incheon, right here. He will drive north to towards the Yalu River, and Chinese forces will drive south of Seoul, and the U.S. and Allied forces will retake Seoul, but a stalemate will ensue, and Truman relieves MacArthur of his command. President Harry Truman relieved General Douglas MacArthur from command of the United Nations troops in Korea when MacArthur began to take issue publicly with presidential policies. He wanted to invade China itself, cross the Yalu River, and if necessary, use atomic weapons. The Korean War will finally end in a stalemated armistice, and the continued hostile division of North and South Korea that still exists today, and the only thing that separates the two countries is the demilitarized zone, because there's still no peace treaty signed between the two rival countries. The great fear of the 1940s and 1950s rested in part on a historic fear of radicalism and foreigners in the United States. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, led by Richard Nixon, the House Committee on Un-American Activities will target the film industry and Hollywood. In an effort to detect communists within the federal government, President Harry Truman will establish the Loyalty Review Board. In 1947, the Truman administration reacted to the growing anti-communist fervor in the country by inflaming the hysteria by issuing an executive order initiating a comprehensive investigation of the loyalty of all federal employees. And the effect of the federal and state loyalty review boards was to create a climate of distrust and unease in government and in society. Features of the increasing domestic anti-communist uproar in the 1940s included 2 American citizens, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were executed as Soviet spies. The House Un-American Activities Committee successfully exposed the State Department's Alger Hiss as a communist agent. Conservative local politicians used communism to attack changes in sexual and cultural values. Teachers and other public employees in many states were forced to sign loyalty oaths. Among anti-communists, Senator Joseph R. McCarthy was the one who most damaged free speech. Senator McCarthy first rose to national prominence by charging that dozens of known communists were working within the U.S. State Department. In response to McCarthy, Eisenhower effectively allowed him to control personnel policy at the State Department, even though he privately loathed Joseph McCarthy, but was unwilling to publicly challenge McCarthy's power. So Senator Joseph McCarthy first rose to national prominence by charging that dozens of known communists were working within the United States Department, but the reality is he will never come up with any names or any known communists within the State Department. As a result of McCarthy's crusade against communist subversion in America, the State Department lost a number of Asian specialists who might have counseled a wiser course in Vietnam. His anti-communist crusade ended when he attacked the United States Army for allegedly sheltering communists, and perhaps his most outrageous charge was that General George C. Marshall was part of a pro-communist conspiracy to betray America. Competition with the Soviets for international support will place pressure on the United States to live up to its own stated democratic ideals. This created new political opportunities and rhetorical tools for advocates to press civil rights claims. An early example of the new international politics of civil rights came in 1948 when President Truman issued his landmark Executive Order 9981 desegregating the armed forces. Even though Truman lacked a popular mandate on the civil rights issue, he will sign an executive order to desegregate the military. On the home front in 1946, post-war America was characterized by an epidemic of labor strikes. The Taft-Hartley Act delivered a major blow to labor by outlawing the closed or all-union shops. This act was passed in 1947 to check the growing power of labor unions. And because of the Taft-Hartley Act, the rapidly growing number of service sector workers, the failure of Operation Dixie, and the growing number of part-time workers, the growth of organized labor in the post-World War II era will be greatly slowed. In an effort to forestall an economic downturn, the Truman administration will sell war factories and other government installations to private businesses at very low prices. It will pass the Employment Act, which made it government policy to promote maximum employment. The Truman administration will create the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And Congress will pass the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill of Rights. Besides giving educational benefits to returning veterans, over 12 million of them, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, or the GI Bill of Rights, was partly intended to prevent returning soldiers from flooding the job market. So the passage of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill of Rights, was partly motivated by the fear that labor markets could not absorb millions of discharged veterans. By raising educational levels and stimulating the construction industry, the GI Bill powerfully nurtured the robust and long-lived economic expansion that eventually took hold in the late 1940s. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill of Rights, included provisions to help veterans gain an education. Over 8 million wartime veterans will benefit from this provision, whether it's vocational or academic. Benefits included $16 million in loans for veterans to buy farms, homes, or businesses. The GI Bill will nurture the nation's economic expansion in the post-war era, and millions of veterans took advantage of the GI Bill programs. In 1948, many Southern Democrats will split from the party to support Governor J. Strom Thurmond because President Truman had taken a strong stand in favor of civil rights. So the Democratic Party in 1948 was bitterly divided between liberal and state rights wings. Even by the end of the 1948 presidential campaign, almost everyone expected Governor Thomas Dewey to win because President Truman seemed unpopular and the Democrats had split three ways. Here's a famous photograph. But Truman will win the election, mainly because of votes from the West. And one reason why Harry S. Truman won an upset victory in 1948 was that he effectively appealed to ordinary voters. He will basically portray the Republican-controlled Congress as a do-nothing Congress. Also, he will win support and credibility in foreign affairs because of the continuing success of the Berlin airlift. When he will be elected in his own right in 1948, Truman will propose a fair deal built on the New Deal by proposing a plan to Congress for expanded federal responsibilities. He fought for the abolition of residential restrictive covenants, a federal anti-lynching law, and a federal agency to guarantee equal employment opportunity. But one of the great traits of post-World War II America by the beginning of the 1950s is that national income will nearly double in the 1950s and almost doubled again in the 1960s. The eruption of affluence in the post-World War II era did not enrich all Americans, and it did not touch all people evenly, but it transformed the lives of a majority of citizens and molded the agenda of politics and society for at least 2 generations. One striking consequence of the post-war economic boom was a vast expansion of the home-owning middle class. And the prosperity of the post-war decades paved the way for all of the following social transformations. It will underwrite social mobility or increase the opportunity to move up economically. It paved the way for the eventual success of the civil rights movement. It funded vast new welfare programs like Medicare, and it gave Americans the confidence to exercise unprecedented international leadership in the Cold War era. So cheap energy, military spending, and rising productivity caused an era of unprecedented growth in American prosperity from 1950 to 1970. One reason is that in post-World War II American workers made spectacular gains in productivity owing to their rising education levels. One feature of this post-war economic prosperity is that there will be a dramatically reduced number of American farms and farmers in the post-war era, but there will be a huge gain in American agricultural productivity and fruit growing because of scientific achievement and application to agriculture. So job opportunities, warm climates, and improved relations will draw millions of white and black Americans to the Sun Belt after World War II. The federal government, much of the Sun Belt's new prosperity was based on the tremendous influx of money from the federal government. The federal government played a large role in the growth of the Sun Belt through its financial support of the aerospace and defense industries. But one sign of this mass movement by millions of Americans after World War II was that there will be an immediate growth of One sign of the stress that the immediate growth of post-World War II geographical mobility placed on American families was the popularity of advice books on child rearing. They will be separated from their mothers, they will be separated from their aunts and uncles, and they will be separated from their parents. So young American families with their families far distance away, they had to look for some guide to how to raise their children. There was no phones, long distance telephone was too costly. So what happened is that one of the most famous of these advice books on child rearing will be Benjamin Spock's book, Baby and Child Care. And it will warn mothers that being too protective might hamper their children's healthy adjustment to adulthood. So we will have a huge Sun Belt created from Virginia to Florida, from Texas to Washington, and you can look at the economic growth in all of these states. And it was basically due to federal spending in 2 industries, the military and the aerospace. Another aspect of this 2-decade-long economic prosperity is that home loan guarantees from the Federal Housing Authority and the Veterans Administration, government-built highways, tax deductions for interest payments on home mortgages, and white flight from racial change will mark the mass movement of American families from urban areas to the suburb. So among the federal policies that contributed to the post-war migration from the cities to the suburbs were housing mortgage tax deduction and federally built highways, home loan guarantees from the FHA and the VA, government-built highways, tax deductions for interest payment on home mortgages, and white flight from racial change all encouraged many post 1945 white Americans to move to the suburbs. So the baby boom, government mortgage guarantees, new federally funded highways, and white flight all contributed to the rapid rise of suburbia in post World War II America. By 1960, the proportion of Americans who lived in areas classified as metropolitan suburbs was approximately 1 out of 4. But the consequence of white flight to the suburbs will leave American cities heavily populated by racial minorities, and the continued growth of the suburbs led to an increase in urban poverty. One reason is that the FHA would not give home loans to blacks, and they had to go to public housing. So the refusal of FHA administrators to grant home loans to blacks resulted in driving many blacks into public housing in urban areas. So the population distribution after World War II followed a pattern of urban-suburban segregation of black and whites in major metropolitan areas. The baby boom of post-World War II America will begin in 1946, and it will continue until 1964, and it will peak in the late 1950s. Children of the baby boom became the foundation of the youth movements of the 1960s and 70s, comprised a lucrative market for prepared baby food and other infant products, and grew into teenagers who spent $20 billion a year on clothes and music. The baby boom in post-World War II America is most accurately explained as resulting from a drop in the age of marriage and the sense of stability that people had in having children. And in the 1950s, American married couples of childbearing years married at a younger age that their parents had done, and almost everybody is having babies at the same time. But the post-war baby boom population expansion will contribute to the popular youth culture of the 1960s.